This is a sample of some of the produce that was grown in the gardens around the prairie homes. The homes used to have to grow their own food because they didn't have money, or they had very little money back in those days, and they didn't have time to go to the store anyway because it could take them a few days on a horse to get to a store. So the little money they had, they tended to use for things they could not grow. So these are some of the produce from the garden, and these are dried beans on the table, and these are dried string beans. And the reason they dried some of the produce is because it would all mature at a certain point, and they couldn't eat all of it at once. And then also in the winter, they didn't have any fresh produce because of the snow. So rather than waste anything, they used to dry it and save it, and then they could use it in the winter to feed their family, and they could hopefully eat healthy meals. This is a crock that they would store things in because they didn't have things such as Tupperware. This is something that they would use to grind herbs, or they would grind corn into cornmeal, or the top of wheat. They would grind that into flour. And this would be a pitcher that they would use to put their milk in, or possibly just cold water. And on top of this jar, they put a piece of material with a string, because they didn't have metal tops back in those days, and they had to do this to keep the bugs or insects out of it, and dirt. That was just a way to keep things clean. This gourd on the top of the fireplace, they would dry those out and cut the top off, and then they could store water or other things inside that gourd. It was a storage container. And this metal thing up there, they would pour beeswax inside, and they would turn that into candles. And there's a candlestick. And then they didn't have pens and pencils back then. They used to have to use quills, which would be the feathers from animals, and they would put it in ink to use for writing. And here are some of the very few utensils that farm families had. Many of them used to have. Pardon me?
Is the noise bothering you?
Oh, not in the slightest. Thank you for asking, but no. Okay, they would have to share some of the utensils. Sometimes they only had 2 cups, and a whole family would have to share those cups. And they cooked on cast iron. It was a very good heat conductor, and they could make stews in there. And they could also, if they were lucky enough to have meat, they could roast meat on that. That was called the spider pot. And in a spider pot, they could turn the lid over, and they could fry on top of that lid. So they could really make everything that they wanted in that spider pot. And that's a coffee kettle, where they would just put in coffee grounds and water, and they would boil the water, and the coffee would stay in there. They didn't have filters, and they would just pour it into a cup, and the grounds would be left in the bottom of the cup. And this is a sample of a spinning wheel. This is either wool from a sheep, or if they didn't have sheep, they would go out and they would get flax, which was a plant that they grew in the fields, and when it would dry, they'd have to comb all the burrs out of the flax and get strands, and that's what they would use to weave also, because they had to make their own clothes. Which one, Jack? Down. So yeah, so this was the spinning wheel, and this was some of the wool, and that would turn into yarn. All their clothes, or many of them, were homespun, and these quilts, families never threw anything away because everything was so precious to them. It was hard to come by. So when clothes got old, rather than throwing them out, they would cut off the pieces that were not worn, and they would save them, and they would sew them into either quilts, or they would weave them or crochet them into rugs. Now this is a covered wagon that families used when they migrated from the east out to the west, and they weren't very large. So the families had to be very careful about what they packed. They would only pack things that were of dire importance to them for their survival. Because in these covered wagons, they had to bring their food, they had to bring protection, their rifles and ammunition, and not only food for themselves, but for the animals. And the food they would bring would be staples that they wouldn't find along the trail, because hopefully they could find plants growing that they could eat, and they could find animals that the dads could go shoot for meat, but they couldn't readily find salt and sugar and flour so that they could make their carbs.
What's this can?
This right here, this tin they would have taken a nail and put holes in it, and then they put a candle in it so that they could see in their covered wagon at night, and it would prevent a fire in case that candle fell over. They didn't have the glass back then for the kerosene, so that's what that would have been. And these are some utensils hanging on the covered wagon. The reason they put metal around the wheel is because the wood would rot if it was in all that mud and rain, or it could split apart. So the metal kept the wheels intact.
Tell them what you
I think that is a toy for a child. It's a bunch of pegs and a little hammer, so I think that was a toy. And this would have been a trunk to store some of their clothing in. And these are barrels that you wouldn't think it, but they can be leak-proof. This one with a hole in it, I highly doubt that would be for the water. I'm not quite sure what they stored in that. But some of these they could put water in and they wouldn't leak. But they had to bring these things with them on their travels. Okay.
So show them what they look like.
Now right here, this part is broken off, but it would have extended further out, and then they would have had a harness, and they would have attached it to oxen or to horses that would pull the covered wagon. And this is the inside of the covered wagon. They put a bar across there with some iron hooks, and that's what they would sort of use as their closet. But you can see they have very few items in that covered wagon. They do have a little toy doll and a chair, but they have a lot of blankets and crocks in there with food.
Next,
Okay.
next one, so we don't do
Okay. This wheat fan separates the chaff from the grain, and I think this would have made life easier for the farmer. I kind of think what this does is, once the hay dries in the field and they chop it off, the top part of the hay with all the little seeds is the part that they would use for food, and the other part they would use to feed the animals or to make hats and brooms, fans, just things that they would be baskets they would make out of it, but they had to separate it, and it used to be by hand. And somehow they would put it in this machine, and somehow it would separate the two. That's what I think that is, Jack.
Okay.
This thing was a machine that a horse would walk on, and as he walked on it, it would pull these back. It would be like he'd keep walking but never get anywhere, and that would have been attached to some, like a kind of a, not a windmill, but something that would make an implement go around to help the farmer. And I'm not sure what the end result would be, but they told me that a horse would walk on that to make something move because they didn't have motors. This is a sample of a plow. Whoops. A plow seeder. When farmers first started, they had to make holes with their hand in the ground and put a seed in and cover it up and then walk a few steps and do the next. What this thing would do, this part in the front of the machine would go into the ground, and then as the farmer pushed it forward on that wheel, it would keep it in a straight line, and it would create a little ditch, and then out of this, seeds would fall into it, so he wouldn't have to plant, and it would fall at intervals based on that. In this last part in the back of the machine, it would cover up the ditch as he went further. So all in one, by this farmer pushing it, it would make a ditch, it would plant the seed, and it would push the dirt over it. So it would be hard for us, but it was so much easier than when they used to have to plant it by hand. And this would have been kind of a new invention on a wagon. See these metal things right here? They would be like shock absorbers, because the first wagons, the seats were just sitting right on the wood, and then if they would go over rocks, which they did often, it would jolt somebody, but this would make a little bit of a spring effect. So they would carry all sorts of things in their wagon.
Amy?
Yes?
What we do